Welcome back to day 2 of the 2021 Sports Society and Social Change Conference. I hope you all had meaningful connections during day 2 of your Words to Action workshops. To reintroduce myself, I am Aaliyah Martinez, a 4th-year undergraduate student in social work at San Jose State University. I'm a current intern with ISSSSC and want to use my voice to uplift marginalized communities with an emphasis on the LGBTQ+ community. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing your moderators for the empowering Call to Action Keynote Conversation, Dr. Travis Boyce and Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique. Dr. Boyce is the Department Chair and Associate Professor of African American Studies, as well as the Director of the Ethnic Studies Collaborative at San Jose State University. His areas of research interests are contemporary African American studies and popular culture. His work has appeared in edited collections and peer-reviewed journals. His most recent work is an edited book titled Historicizing Fear, Ignorance, Vilification, and Othering. Additionally, Dr. Boyce served as a guest editor for a special issue in Fashion, Style, and Popular Culture. Welcome, Dr. Boyce. And Dr. Akilah, I will hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaliyah. Gosh, just phenomenal work from our interns. So I have to send a shout out to each and every one of them that has been so instrumental in supporting this conference. Send a shout out also to my amazing team, Dr. Amy August and the incomparable Beth Doyle. I would say on the ones and twos if we think in DJs, but that's my mindset right now, but she is literally doing it all. And of course, a shout out to our events team that is really creating a space for us to have this conversation with you today. So we're gonna get started and Dr. Boyce will be joining us shortly, but I'm gonna have a quick chat with Dave Zirin. So I want you guys to think about this. In this closing session here, this closing keynote conversation is designed to be a culminating conversation and serve in proper ISSSC fashion as a call to action. Many gems were shared yesterday and even over today. So it's my hope that you've been able to glean some information, some resources, learn something new, and most importantly, acknowledge the history, perspectives, and share with others. So in this last panel of our 2021 Sports Society and Social Change Conference, it's gonna be informational. It's gonna be inspirational. So keep those notebooks open. And again, to our San Jose State student athletes that are out in the audience, I wanna give a shout out and some love to you. Open those apps, those note apps, and be ready to lean into all that our panelists have to say. So to keep it moving, Dave Zirin. He's a sports editor for The Nation magazine, the first sports correspondent in the 155-year history of the publication. He's the author of 11 books on politics of sports, including most recently, The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. He's also a columnist for The Progressive and a host of popular weekly podcasts on Edge of Sports. Welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And yes, doctor, as you saw, the pandemic has grayed me out a little bit, but I'm still very happy to be here, despite me not going to a stylist beforehand.
Hey, none needed, none needed. Now, following our brief chat with Dave, we're gonna welcome an esteemed colleague of his, and I'm gonna allow him to do the introductions. So everybody sit tight for what we've got in store. And so with that, I'm just gonna keep the conversation moving because we've got some more gems are gonna be dropped, more knowledge is gonna be dropped. So with that said, it is time, which is our theme, our muse for this particular conference, a piece written by Dr. Harry Edwards in 2018 in the midst of the Kaepernick experience, since we're using Kaepernick effect, right? So before we get into Kaepernick and the Kaepernick effect, your amazing book, could you share for us and our audience your journey into the space of sport media and even your current role at the Nation?
No, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. After I wrote my first book, What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States, this is 2005, I went out to Berkeley and I did a talk in front of about 15 students, and Dr. Edwards showed up. I had no idea, with a t-shirt of Tommy Smith and John Carlos that he had signed for me. Mm-hmm. And for me, Dr. Harry Edwards was like something out of a comic book. Like I never, like the idea of him standing in front of me was, and now that shirt is framed in my basement and it's been there for the last 16 years. So me speaking at this conference to me is like a full circle type experience. And I know that didn't answer your question, but I'm just feeling so happy to be here. I wanted to share that.
Definitely. And I have to say real quick before you go into that, shout out again to my students that I'm teaching in my race, sport, activism, and social movements class under the leadership of Dr. Travis Boyce. They're reading your book, What's My Name Fool, currently. So, you know, I just have to, I told my students, I'm like, I got somebody special. So they're in the space as well. Yes.
Amazing. I mean, there's so many people who I want to hear from who are not me that I'll just give the quick version. I mean, I was in college. It was 1996. There was a basketball player named Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf for the Denver Nuggets. And I was an absolute sports fanatic in college, but I was also very much into politics, very much into social justice activism. I used to like to look around campus and count which buildings I had occupied and which ones were still to be occupied. So yeah, that was more where my head was in college. And for me, sports was just a sidetrack. It was a separate love. It didn't have anything to do with my politics or anything like that. But then I saw Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf of the Denver Nuggets make the private decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem anymore. And a reporter got wind of it and asked Abdul-Rauf, don't you realize that that flag is a symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world? And Rauf responded by saying, well, that flag may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it's a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others. And when he said that, it was like the sports world was turned on its head in a way that I had never seen before. I remember ESPN was like, Rauf spits on the flag, booyah, din-in-it, din-in-it. And we would always gather in the common room to watch it, Sports Center at 7, just to find the latest of what was happening in this story. And I heard one of the commentators say, well, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf must see himself as an athlete activist in the tradition of people like Muhammad Ali or Billie Jean King, Tommy Smith, John Carlos. And I had never heard that phrase before, activist, athlete, activist, like these words coming together. It was like two sparks it was like a stone coming together with a spark. And it was just, my mind was aflame with this idea that like I wanted to apply what I knew about history and politics to my love of sports. I wanted to bring those worlds together. So I started trying to get jobs at newspapers at a school. And what I said to them was like, look, I'll do anything for this paper. I'll sweep the floors. I'll call for ads. I'll do whatever. But all I ask is for once a week, a little piece of the paper that's like 800 words where I can write about this collision of sports and politics. And that was almost 20 years ago. And I was doing that. And then a member of my family started putting the articles online. They were seen by The Nation magazine. They offered me a job, and now we're here.
Gotta love the family. Gotta love the family. I mean, my father's the same way. He'll cut out every article. He'll save everything. He'll scan it. But that's what we do when we support those that are doing great work and really stepping into their passion. So I thank you for that, and thank you for your efforts. Now, one of the things that you spoke about is just the influence of politics and history in your own education. And I want to sort of speak into this moment that we've had this past year and a half will be written into history. How do you believe we will write the moment's history? When we think about COVID-19, when we think about Black Lives Matter, when we think about athlete activism and those voices, and at the same time, how may sport factor into the history and the political landscape, the social commentary, and even cultural spaces?
Well, you know, there's an expression that's all too sad and all too true, that history is written by the winners. So I apply that to this discussion and say, will we win? Ask that question, will we win? Like, when I say will we win, I mean, are we going to be able to push forward as a society towards a multiracial working democracy? Or are we going to continue down a path of inequality, racism, and fear? And if inequality, racism, and fear win out, then I can guarantee you how this history is going to be taught. It's going to be taught in the schools in a way that's incredibly disjointed, that marginalizes protests, that marginalizes voices. Maybe there'll be like a picture of Colin Kaepernick in the high school history book, but it'll just be like a 2-word caption with no explanation whatsoever, and it might take up 5 minutes of school. I mean, your teacher might want to teach it for 60 minutes, but because of the latest critical race theory laws in their state, they'd be worried about losing their job, so they won't be able to teach Colin Kaepernick. It'll just be this side note, and it'll be like the equivalent of how people, in the 1980s learned about the civil rights movement, certainly my education. In other words, it'll be a truncated, cut off history that's reframed through the prism of reaction. That's one alternative. Another alternative is that in 20, 30 years, we're talking about this moment as the true synthesis of politics, anti-bigotry, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and sports. We're going to tell a story about how many roads may have led us to this reckoning with this country's history and how to move forward collectively. But one of those roads runs straight through the athletic fields of the United States. And when we talk about Colin Kaepernick in our history classes, it won't be just speaking about him as some kind of individual who took a knee and then he couldn't get hired again in the NFL. It won't be the story of an individual. It will be about a Kaepernick effect, where hundreds, if not thousands of young athletes will tell the stories. We're going to tell the stories about how they were inspired, to take a knee, about how they were inspired to challenge this country to be better and challenge their communities to be better. So it's really this question of history being written by the winners. Like, if we're able to push forward, then I can see this history being taught in a beautiful, holistic way. And if we're pushed back, then it's going to be like trying to teach about slavery in Texas.
Okay, we got our first mic drop. Honestly, I mean, there's so much going on in our school systems. There's so much that is affecting the educational opportunities for our young people. And, I think this is creating another rising of our students, even saying, hey, we want to know the full truth. We want to know more. And you speak of this influence of the Kaepernick effect on our youth and on different age groups. Let's get into it. The Kaepernick effect, right? Taking the knee, changing the world, was released in September, so just a few weeks ago. Can you tell us sort of the premise of this work, how it came to be?
Absolutely. I mean, it came to be because I was having a conversation with someone who San Jose State might be familiar with, a man by the name of Dr. John Carlos. You might have seen them on the statue.
Yeah. Yes, we just had a Smith Carlos Day. Yeah, we just had a Smith Carlos Day on campus. So numbers of students came out, faculty, staff, former Speed City individuals, to be able to honor and recognize the efforts that Smith, Carlos, those from Speed City, Dr. Harry Edwards, Ken Noel, all had and contributed to that effort on that day. So yes.
And they are hanging on your left shoulder as we speak.
Right here. Uh-oh, right one.
Yeah. Oh, right. God, this is so trippy.
I know.
I swear it's left to me. So I was John Carlos. I did his memoir with him, and so we've been very, very close. That's a very bonding process. Putting his life story to paper, and so we've remained close. And he said to me in a very offhand way a couple of years ago, there were a lot of people in 1968 after we raised our fists who started raising fists at their own games. I'm talking about young people at track meets, at football games. You saw them raising their fists. I used to hear about that all the time. And the history major in me, the synapses just went off in my brain. Like, John, what are you talking about? Lots of young people raise their fists. I had no idea. We got to tell their stories. What happened to them? What happened with their coaches? What happened with their teammates? What were they trying to accomplish? But of course, it's been over 50 years, so I did not know how I would begin to think about putting a book together about that. But it did make me think really sharply about all of these sort of one-off articles that I'd seen, some of which I've written, about young people who in the last several years had taken a knee after Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the anthem to protest racial inequity and police brutality. All of these stories about kids who got kicked off of teams, kids who had garbage thrown at them from the stands, kids who faced down death threats, football players, cheerleaders, softball players, soccer players, band members. I mean, people singing the national anthem themselves, dropping to the knee during the song. And I just said to myself, you know what? We got to collect these voices. Otherwise, they're going to be forgotten the same way those voices of '68 were forgotten. So I started getting in touch with these folks. And this was at the start of the pandemic. And so a lot of kids were at home. And fortunately, they were willing to talk, because I don't know about folks out there watching, but my experience is when you call a teenager, they're like, "Why are you calling me? Is there an emergency?" And then you say, "No, then you should have texted." I'm quoting my 17-year-old daughter as we speak. So, but because you had this situation where they were home at the start of the pandemic, I think they were a little bit bored and just really happy to talk to me about their experiences. So I got this incredible rich data, the kind of stuff a journalist dreams about, of the stories. And I found out that the real story was not so much why they took a knee, but what happened after they took a knee. The backlash, how they managed the backlash. So I've got dozens of stories in this book about young people walking through the paces of protest and what they went through during that process. So I'm putting all this book together. And then the summer of 2020 happens, the police murder of George Floyd, the largest demonstrations in the history of the United States. And I don't think we say that enough in talking about the summer of 2020, like really framing it as that. It was the demonstrations in all 50 states that had never happened in the history of this country. And I called all the people that I'd interviewed to say, like, "Hey, are you part of this? What's going on? How are you feeling? Are you okay?" And they were all either in the streets or organizing people to get into the streets. And that made me realize that while many roads may have led us to this summer of 2020, one of those roads runs straight through the playing fields of the United States.
I'm just exhaling, because even to hear about our youth receiving backlash, our youth receiving death threats in the midst of all that's going on, just those young people, it is hard to absorb. And especially with having children myself, young children, right? At 6, almost 7 and 10, it's hard to take and hard to sort of hear that reality, but it is a reality that they're living with in this generation. Mm-hmm. With that said, I really grow appreciative of your work, of your writings, your ability to educate, really provide context. I mean, you just gave us some rich context there, but even just the opportunity and I think the foresight to say, we need to elevate, we need to illuminate these voices. Now, when talking about the Kaepernick effect, it's broken into 3 sort of key areas: high school, college, and the pros. And without giving us too much away, because y'all got to go buy it. I'm just saying, we got to go buy it, right? Explain the structuring of the Kaepernick effect and having those 3 key chapters.
Absolutely. And I'll just say, if folks are financially a little light, just go to the local library and say, "Please order this book." So many ways to get books in our hands, especially if you treasure the written word. I gotta say, how to divide the book was subject of a lot of debate, and with my editor, and even with friends and family. Like, some people said I should do it by sport. Other folks said it should be done in terms of like where the person was relative to the movement, like people who had been directly affected by police violence, people who had, it had happened more through social media were affected, white allies who took a knee, have that be a completely separate section. And the more I spoke to folks, the more it became clear that there were very, very distinct challenges in terms of being a high school student who decides to take a knee during the anthem, a college student, and a professional athlete. And that seemed like the way I needed to group it, because of out of really respect for the very particular challenges that each of those categories faces when they put themselves out there in such a way. And I didn't want to make it like I was ranking it or putting value judgments on one versus the other, because they all have their own difficulties, yet these difficulties are very distinct. So if you're in, I mean, we all remember what it was like to be in high school. I mean, the idea of standing out, the idea of looking foolish, especially if you're on a sports team, the idea of alienating your coach, these are very scary concepts. Yeah. And so to have these young people willing to take a knee, I mean, that's a powerful statement of bravery unto itself relative to the age. Fast forward to college, if you're a scholarship athlete, you know you're risking that scholarship by taking a knee. Or if you're in a small college, like a Division III school, you could be putting yourself in a situation where you are made so uncomfortable in, say, a small school that only has 1,100, 1,200 students, that you can get, really feel pushed out, which happened to a couple of the people I interviewed with. They actually felt like they had to leave their college afterwards. That's its own particular issue. And then at the professional level, of course, you're risking that check. And you're risking, when one plays professional sports, one has a very narrow window. We don't think about it this way, but you're going to earn probably most of the money you're going to earn in your entire life before you're 28 years old. And then you and your family are going to need to be expected to find some way to build generational security around what you make over the course of 5 years. I mean, it's completely bonkers if you take a step back from it, and so you're risking that when you take that knee, because you're risking it for what you believe to be a higher principle. And I wanted to give space and respect to each of those sections. And when you read the book, two points I want to make real quick is that it's not really my voice that you're going to hear when you read it. Like, there's a strong emphasis that I made to center their voices, because it is their voice, and because Colin Kaepernick hasn't said a great deal over the last several years. I think we're going to hear more in the weeks ahead when his special comes out on Netflix, but we haven't heard a lot. And so I really had to think about, well, whose voice is going to fill that vacuum, and whose voice should fill that vacuum? It certainly shouldn't be my voice. It should be the voices of the people who've risked, who've actually stepped into the arena and risked their own safety and security for this higher purpose. Of fighting racial inequity, fighting police violence, fighting for a better world. They were the ones who should be on front, and they're the ones who should be centered. So that was a point of the book. And then the last thing, just because people sometimes have this question, and I just want to say it, is that any money I make from this book is going to a mutual aid society in DC called Serve Your City DC. And I want folks to know that, because it was very important for me. It's not just trying to do good deeds or whatever, or get a clap on the back, but it's like politically, it's important that their courage not result in my profit. Their courage should be paid forward to the next generation. And this mutual aid group, Serve Your City, they do exactly that. They do not just political education, but really survival education for some of the poorest neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. So this is going to support their work at Serve Your City.
And that in itself is, again, a social action, an activist act in and of itself. So thank you for that. And thank you for explaining, again, this notion of voices and what that means. At this time, I want to invite Dr. Boyce onto the platform. And as we explore more of your work, particularly the voices and the selection of those voices, I actually want you to share one of those voices with us, who is here with us today, and introduce the efforts of Jesse Hagopian. So Dave, could you give us an introduction of Jesse and help us?
Jesse? I get to introduce Jesse?
You get to introduce him. That's how the relationship came. And and honestly, for our audience out there, when I was speaking with Dave and asked to say, hey, can you be on here? He shared Jesse's story, and I was like, this is amazing. But I think it's important for me that you sort of share and introduce how you came to know him. And how you came to understand his experience, his story, and those particular efforts. And I know we'll have some folks kind of help out here on the screen and get everybody on this platform with us. But Dave, I'd love to hear.
I'm looking back through my Jesse books. I have some of his books behind me, but I won't try to get them. Yeah, I mean, first of all, Dr. Boyce, hello.
Dr. Boyce is muted.
Oh, okay, I just want to
Yeah.
get
How are you? Good to see you.
Yeah.
proper salutations. It's lovely to see you. And Jesse Hagopian, this is actually going to be very fun. I'm going to introduce Jesse. You see, the thing is, I could have list, awards that Jesse has won as a teacher and an activist, and he's won quite a few. It's like an 11-year-old's trophy chest or something. They just spill off the shelves. I could be holding up his books like More Than a Score, or talk about the book that he's going to be writing coming up, called Teach Truth, which is about the fight to actually teach the truth to our kids in states like Texas and in, frankly, several dozen other states where they're trying to stop the teaching of the truth about racism in this country. I think this book is just going to be a banger. Jesse's writing it right now. But the main thing I'll say is, I met Jesse almost 20 years ago after the start of the war in Iraq. Even though we went to the same college, we actually were not there at the same time. And that just came like a coincidence, which is kind of crazy because if you know the college we went to, it's called McAllister. It's only got 1,700 people. So when you go to a small school and you meet someone from a small school, you immediately have like a ton of stuff to talk about. Like, oh, really? What dorm did you stay in? Because there's like 3 on campus. So immediately we were just vibing about college. And it became very clear as we attempted to go into activist circles around education and around the war that Jesse was able to make any room better in terms of being an activist center that was going to fight and do something. And that was just like, I noticed that right away, because some of these meetings would be like in dusty church basements, it would be drafty and people would look like they didn't want to be there. And, the vibe could be sour and why aren't there more people here? And, oh, everyone's just brainwashed and everyone's feeling negative. And then Jesse would come in and it was just like, boom, it was like, going on strike inside a wind tunnel. You just were like, whoosh, let's do this thing. And so that's the best way to introduce Jesse. Oh, he also teaches at Garfield High School in Seattle. I should probably add that. And he's taken a school that was once home to Quincy Jones and Jimi Hendrix and actually written his own chapter in the history of Garfield High School. So in a school that has chapters named after the Q and after Jimmy, there's a chapter named after Jesse for what he did there, first as a student, but then also as a teacher, as a mentor, and as somebody who at that school has been the glue between a lot of the athletes at the school and the coaches, all of whom were thinking about, we have to do something because this world is just too unjust. There's just too much racism in the world. It was Jesse who really took their anger and was able to help mold it into action. And it's an honor to call him a colleague in this fight because he's somebody who brings it each and every day.
Wow, Dave. Thank you so much, man. It's been incredible to get to work with you over the years and also just to get to kick it on your couch and watch some sports games too.
Right on. Well, I guess we'll keep talking. Jesse, I wanted to just throw at you, Jesse. One of the things in the book, The Kaepernick Effect, is about Garfield High School and the school, of course, where you work, and about how Garfield was the first school to have an entire team take a knee. And I've been telling that story over and over again as I've been doing interviews for the book. I've been like a recruiter for Garfield High or something, the way I've been talking to them so much. But I would love to hear it from your perspective as a teacher there. What was it like when you started to hear that some of the athletes were being politicized? And what was your role as a teacher in that context?
It was an incredible moment. You have to remember this was the summer after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed, and there was so much grief and trauma about just the ongoing, endless onslaught of police murdering Black bodies, right? And to see our campus erupt and take center stage in this fight transformed the conversation at our high school and our city. And, they showed up in Time magazine with their picture all taking a knee. It helped to transform the conversation across the country. And what made it so special for me was that some of the leaders of that struggle had developed their ideas about the world and their place in it in some of my classes. And, you know, it was particularly heartwarming to see Jelani, one of the football players who led the team taking a knee in that action, because Jelani had been in my world history class. And I started that class off with the unit on identity because I didn't want to just launch into teaching things that happened in the past without having students understand their own identity and their relationship to those events of the past. So we started with the unit on identity, and in that unit, we used Dave's film, Not Just a Game, to talk about identity, because I wanted to talk about the way that sports help shape our identity and the way that sports either reinforce master narratives about race and gender and sexuality, or the way they can provide a platform for athletes to fight back against racial injustice and other forms of oppression, right? And so Jelani was, you know, glued to his seat for these conversations. He went from a more quiet kid in the back to like somebody who had a lot to say, and felt like this lesson was connecting with his experience. And, you know, we read some of Dave's essays and we analyzed the film. And I did the same with another student of mine, Janelle, who was in my world history and in my ethnic studies class. And both of those students went on to lead their teams in taking a knee. Janelle took her softball team all the way to winning the state championship, the first time a Seattle school had won the state championship, mostly Black team, and shocked the softball world. And they did it all taking a knee, and they did it facing so much abuse. And Dave writes about it beautifully in the book. And it was incredible to get to see the look on their faces reading the book, seeing that they had really helped to shape the national discussion, and their words were part of this movement now.
Hi, Jesse. This is Travis. Nice to meet you and welcome.
Good to meet you, Travis.
Definitely. I must say this before I pose my question to you. There is a documentary called The Heart of the Game that was released in 2005, featuring high school girls basketball in the Seattle area. Yeah. And there was a reference.
Love that film.
Yeah, Garfield High School is referenced in the film. So,
yes.
So awesome. I just wanted to make a comment about that.
Yeah,
And also for the
everybody
audience.
should watch that film. Incredible.
Definitely, because it does, provide some context to race and class in the Seattle area. We often think about the Pacific Northwest as being this utopian society, but they have their issues just like the lower 48 of the United States. So yeah, I just want to make that comment first. And also, again, just to welcome you. But I want to back up a little bit first so that the audience have some context of who you are. And so my question to you is tell us about your journey into education, social action, and activism.
Right on. Well, Dave told a little bit about it, but to flush out some details, after I graduated from McAllister, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I began teaching in Southeast D.C., and I would pass by the White House on my way to school. And 10 minutes later, after crossing the Anacostia River, I was in a neighborhood like nothing I'd ever seen before, right? One of the most segregated and impoverished communities in the country. And my first day of teaching, I assigned the students to go home with a little brown paper bag I gave them, and to come back the next day with something in that bag that spoke to who they were as a human being. I said, don't just put your favorite video game in there or something. I really want to know who you are. So the next day, we're all seated in a circle. This is a 5th grade class. And the first girl pulls out a card from her paper bag, and it's her dad's driver's license. And she told me she carried it with her everywhere because he was locked up and she wasn't going to see him for a long time. And then the next kid pulled out a picture of his dad who had been shot and killed that summer. And every single one of those kids pulled out a picture of a loved one who had either been killed or was incarcerated. And by the time it got to me, I was just in a panic. Like, I had a baseball and a photo, and I just had no idea how I was going to be able to meet the needs of these youth. And then you have to remember that this is 2001. I began teaching just weeks before 9/11, and we actually could see the smoke from the Pentagon rising from our classroom window. And some of my kids' families had, family members that worked as janitors there. It was a terrifying day. But there was something that was even more scary to me that occurred, because we found out that this nation could mobilize untold billions of dollars to go bomb other families halfway across the world, but couldn't fix the hole in the ceiling of my classroom just 10 minutes from the White House. That was terrifying to me. I mean, the first research assignment I ever assigned was destroyed before they could present their projects, because it just rained into my classroom and destroyed the project, right? And so here I am in the world's richest country, in the seat of power, and these kids have just been abandoned completely while we mobilize money for death and destruction. And that was really the higher degree education that I received from my students that year that sent me on this path. I returned to Seattle to get my master's degree and continue teaching. And there, I helped to lead a boycott of standardized testing at my school, where the entire faculty refused to give a high stakes standardized test that we, said had its origins in eugenics and racism and was a waste of time and money of our kids. And then we also helped to launch the Black Lives Matter at School movement that's then spread to Philadelphia and then all across the country. So, I've really tried to focus on not only transforming the pedagogy in my classroom to be about anti-racism and empowering my youth to join social movements, but also joining those movements myself.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And just again, the excellent work in those K-12 settings. I'm the child and the product of two K-12 educators that started their work in Topeka, Kansas, to really live and fulfill out that Brown v. Board legislation. So I appreciate and I value all that you've done. Understanding that work, reading through your bio, and again, as Dave said, there's multiple accolades in that. How did you find yourself into the space of sport and athleticism? In particular, could you tell us a little bit more about Athletes for Impact?
For sure. Well, I think that the way Mahmoud Abdul Rauf had an impact on Dave had an impact on me. I had always defined my identity as an athlete for most of my life until after my first year playing baseball in college, when I stopped. And when I stopped, I kind of quit cold turkey, and I, there was difficulties on the team, and I didn't fit in with the culture there. And I started joining social movements and seeing that as much more important than sports. And Dave was so critical to me being able to see how the two could come together and rekindle my love for athleticism. And, when we launched the Black Lives Matter at School movement in Seattle, it was because a white supremacist made a bomb threat against an elementary school because they wanted to wear black shirts that said Black Lives Matter to celebrate their Black youth. And so I helped to organize a day of action where we got 3,000 out of the 5,000 educators in Seattle to wear shirts to school in solidarity with John Muir Elementary School that all said Black Lives Matter. And we had a big culminating rally at a town hall event. And at that event, we had students doing spoken word and panels about what needed to change in education. We had songs and dancing, but we also had Michael Bennett, and Seattle Seahawks Pro Bowler, Super Bowl champion, took time out to come and lend his voice to the struggle. And, you know, I met him there backstage. And ever since that moment, we've been organizing together. And, you know, Athletes for Impact was founded that same year before we had ever heard of it. But, you know, I helped consult with Michael through that year of him refusing to stand for the anthem, right? And connected him with the family of Charlena Lyles, who was a woman who was killed in her own apartment in front of her kids by a police officer here in Seattle. And, you know, he helped to organize a rally for Charlena Lyles, not just sending tweets out about social injustice, but actually meeting the family and organizing a rally with them. And, you know, we realized that we needed to help cohere athletes together in an organization. And then we found that Athletes for Impact was already beginning to do that. And so we both joined Athletes for Impact together and have been part of many campaigns. Right now, Athletes for Impact is partnering with one of our members, Layla Ali, who was one of the greatest female boxing champions of all time. Her dad was Muhammad Ali, and she's leading a campaign called Knockout Human Trafficking. One of our members is Maya Moore, and she is leading the Win with Justice campaign, which is about ending mass incarceration. And Dave has written extensively about Maya. But, you know, if Maya was a male athlete, there would probably be statues to her all over the country. She's one of the greatest champions who ever lived. She's won a championship every 2 years of her life since middle school. And I had the great honor of getting to partner with her to design a lesson for her middle school, because she quit basketball at the height of her career, right, to go and try to free an innocent man from prison, Jonathan Irons, who received a 50-year sentence for a crime he didn't commit. And she devoted her life to freeing him. And she went back, taught this lesson, did all these media events, led this movement, and she freed him. And it's one of the most beautiful stories of athlete activism I know of.
So, Dave, I have an additional question for you. As an educator, and you spoke particularly extensive of pre-Black Lives Matter, post 9/11, pre-Black Lives Matter movement. So we're in this present moment, age of Black Lives Matter, the age of racial reckoning. We're living in this COVID age, which is weird. In this present moment, explain the need for Black Lives Matter at schools at the K through 12 level.
Oh, well, I think Jesse, who started the struggle, or at least was part of the organization that started the struggle of Black Lives Matter at schools, he'd be the one to speak about its urgency and immediacy. But I'm not going to shy away from the question, because I have a 13-year-old in school, I have a 17-year-old in school, and I recognize that, we live in a society that is systemically, and that word systemically is so important, but racist. And so it raises the question about how are we going to uproot systems of racism going forward? And it starts by the very assertion of Black life in a society that does not value it nearly as much as it should. And the idea of that being part of my children's education, I think, is fundamental for building the kind of world worth fighting for, which currently I would argue we do not live in, particularly not in Texas, but other states as well. And it's such an important, the tragedy is that it has to be taught at all, but the reality is that it must be taught. Mm-hmm. And I think, and until we live in a society where we truly feel that all life has the required value in order to be able to push forward and prosper, and isn't being held down for nefarious purposes, then we have to keep pushing forward. And so that's, I think, the value of it actually in our schools, speaking about fundamental lessons. And when I say this, I just want to be clear that like this means speaking about these issues in a cross-disciplinary fashion, that with a particular emphasis on history. So it's not just about sloganeering for the kids or having t-shirt day, as important as the teachers wearing the t-shirts was, but just not having it be just at the level of sloganeering. But you know, like we're the NFL doing some sort of awareness month or something, but you know, but actually something deeper and more fundamental. And I just have so much respect for every teacher in this country right now, including my wife, who's a U.S. history teacher here in D.C.
And
who
one
are
of
actually
my
trying
mentors too.
Yeah, who are really trying to teach this in the face of a growing tide of people who, I mean, seem set on teaching lies in the classroom as being a fundamental prerequisite of even living in peace in this country. Like, you want to live in peace, you want to live without us screaming or doing worse in your face, then you better teach lies to our children. You know, that's the message that I'm hearing. And by the way, I just got to jump in with this, like in the Kaepernick Effect book, I was talking to, you know, Eddie Glaude, professor from Princeton, Dr. Glaude, and Dr. Glaude, he read the book and he said to me, do you realize, Dave, that one of the common threads with all these stories that you don't really talk about is that there's this thread of violence in every case when these young people take a knee. They're performing this act of nonviolent civil disobedience, and the response is not, well, let's agree to disagree or let's talk through our differences. The response is, I am going to hurt you because you are expressing ideas that I do not want to hear. And in that regard, and this is part of what Dr. Glaude was point he was making, was that these young people from 2016 to 2020 are in a lot of ways like the canary in the coal mine on this so-called critical race theory debate, you know, because they were attempting to have a discussion, and the response was one that I would argue is violent and only rational if viewed through the prism of white supremacy.
Yeah, no doubt. And I'll just add real quick that, you know, it's already 11 states in the United States, it's illegal to teach the truth to children. 28 states have included this, have proposed legislation that would require teachers to lie to students about structural racism and sexism and other forms of oppression. And, you know, they're attacking the 1619 Project, the Zirin Education Project, Black Lives Matter at School. These are all primary targets. And as Dave said, they're not just saying we don't like what you have to say. There are threats of bodily harm being done to educators who want to teach the fact that this country was founded on enslavement of African people and genocide of Native people, like just the basic facts. And I have been working with teachers all across the country who are facing death threats for doing this kind of incredible work. And it's just, to me, a boundless satire, this country, when you think about the fact that, you know, Juneteenth becomes a federal holiday at the same time that it becomes illegal to teach about it all across the country, or that President Biden makes a proclamation to declare May 31st a day of remembrance for the Tulsa Race Massacre at the same time that Oklahoma outlaws the teaching of the truth about structural racism, right? And so I think that, you know, the struggle for a liberatory education started since, you know, it was illegal for Black people to learn to read and write. The Stonewall Rebellion of 1739 was what launched the first laws in South Carolina outlawing Black people being able to learn to read and write. And we fought back ever since then. And today's racists aren't so bold as to ban the reading of the word, but they do want to ban the reading of the world, as Paulo Freire put it. They want us to not understand how society works, so that we can't change it. And that's really what our Teach Truth movement and the Black Lives Matter at School movement is all about.
And I could just say in one district where they banned the reading of the works of Toni Morrison, I mean, you might as well outlaw the reading of the word. I mean, to say that Toni Morrison shouldn't be read in a classroom, you're basically saying that people shouldn't read at all.
Yeah.
No doubt.
And this conversation is so rich. And one of the things that we created to support this particular segment was what's called a Spark page that has all of the amazing work that you all have contributed, have written, are participating in, and are continuing that activist effort. But one of the main things I want all of our panelists, and not only our panelists, but our audience is to take away, is to walk away with some calls to action. Thinking about these past 2 days, thinking about the work, thinking about the Kaepernick effect, whether it be from an activism standpoint, an educational standpoint. For each of you, Dave and Jesse, what are those final takeaways that we can get in this moment and come from, and that you can share with our audience? What are those calls to action as we go back into our respective workspaces, our respective athletic spaces, our respective school spaces, and even as parents, right? What do you suggest that we begin to sort of think about, consider, and move towards as we talk about words to action?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll go first because Jesse, was a cleanup hitter back in his baseball days. So I'll try to just get on base so he can send me home here. I keep thinking of this cartoon of that I've been thinking about as I've been talking and working on the Kaepernick effect, of this older person looking down at a younger person and saying, "What's wrong with you? Why are you depressed all the time?" And the young person looks up at him and says, "Gee, I don't know. Maybe it's racism. Maybe it's school shootings. Maybe it's the environment. Maybe it's the pandemic." And the old person says, "I knew it was those cell phones." And I think that's where we're at right now. I think that people of a certain age, of which I count myself among them, are not quite getting their heads around the fact that this young generation is more demographically diverse and less tolerant of intolerance than any generation in the history of the United States. And they have it in them to make, if not remake, the world. And they're just not going to settle for what their parents or grandparents were willing to settle for in terms of what passes for justice in this country. I really do truly feel like they have a thirst to demand more. I mean, this is not the generation of Cheech and Chong. This is the generation of taking it to the house. And they are so much more calloused than my generation, for example. Like, they are tough. Like, Dr. Akilah, you were speaking about your kids, and the people who I interviewed are basically, they were your kids' age when Trayvon Martin was killed. And they carry that with them. They were old enough to know that he was killed by killed by George Zimmerman. And they were also young enough to ask the question, why does the world really need to be this way? And so when I spoke with them, I went from being a pessimist to being an optimist. But at the same time, I say to anybody out there who's above that, say, let's call it age 25 threshold, that, it's also not enough for us to just fold our arms and say, "Oh, thank goodness the young generation will save us." I truly believe that what we have to figure out is how to provide ideological, political, organizational, and material support so this young generation can center themselves and take their place on the stage of history. Because if they're able to do that with the proper support, I'll take this around to one of your first questions, Dr. Akilah, then I think that the history will be written in a way that speaks to the best impulses of justice and the best impulses of what we mean when we say the words social equality.
Another gem, again, dropping knowledge. And again, I thank you again, because my kids, my heart, and the students that I work with that are on the platform today are really our joy and our future. So I thank you for that direction and that guidance as we go into our next spaces that we'll interact with them. Jesse, I leave the final words to you with regards to what are our calls to action in this moment as we think about all that's happened over the past few months, but also considering the rich history and the truth that has to be told.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's an urgent need to transform education in this country. And I think athletes and student athletes, as Dave details in the Kaepernick effect, really have a role to play in that. And the need to transform education was urgent before all these bills were being passed to outlaw the teaching of the truth about structural racism, right? But it's so much more desperately needed now. And you know, so much of education today is about competition over standardized test scores and grades and slots into a few slots into college that you can get to. And I think we have to transform education to be about solving problems in our society, right? And I think that maybe in a utopia, we could have a different goal. But in this society, where we have more Black people behind bars than were enslaved on plantations in 1850, right? In this society, where we have 5 people who have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on the planet, right? In a society where women experience sexual assault at, 1 in 3, and their right to choose is under assault, where we have a society that blames immigrants and deports Haitian migrants from the border. In this society where climate change is threatening the very existence of humanity in the short term, we have existential crises facing us, many overlapping crises. And this is exactly why I think Dave's book is so powerful, because young people have lived through this, are experiencing it, and are finding unique, amazing, creative ways to resist. And our athletes have such a platform, right? They're given that platform in high school, in college, in pros. And, that's why from John Carlos's generation till now, the refrain from the rich and powerful has always been shut up and dribble and just play this game, because they don't want those voices of people who have experienced those overlapping crises to emerge, right? But we don't care anymore what they want, and our young people don't care, because it's not working for our lives, and because we educators refuse to lie to kids anymore. And so we have launched the Teach Truth campaign that I urge everybody to join in on. We have a corresponding athletes for Teach Truth, and we have over 7,000 signatures of educators around the country, including in states where it's been banned to teach the truth, educators pledging that they will teach the truth no matter what, and athletes signing up to support those educators, making donations to bring materials and books to those classrooms to help educators do just that. So I hope to link arms with everybody here in the struggle that's to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I had a number of follow-up questions, but both Dave, you and Jesse, you both brought them into your final comments. So I thank you. And thank Dr. Travis Boyce for being with us as well. And the efforts you're making, Dr. Boyce, I have to say, here at San Jose State, not only running the Department of African American Studies, but also cheering up our ethnic studies collective in those efforts. And that's a big feat. And so I'm under great leadership. I appreciate you. And I'm in this space with these 2 amazing individuals that are, again, writing their own chapters that we have to be able to make sure that your names are in those history books as well, for our children to learn more about you and your efforts. So I thank you for being here, sharing that knowledge. Again, we put together toolkits, so we have information on what you both have spoken about, your works, those actionable items, and those respective efforts that you're doing to educate through the Zen Project. Thank you again.
Wow, thanks so much. Y'all, this has been a real honor and pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Absolutely.
And I do have one follow-up question from our attendees. The shirt. I know we're going off script. I'm sorry, events crew. But they want to know where you got your shirt from and where they can.
Well, I forget where I got this one, but everybody should go to Actively Black, which has a whole John Carlos collection that you can choose from. So check that out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jesse, we thank you. Dave, we thank you. Dr. Travis Boyce, we thank you.
Thank you.